Think back to the last time you had to write something purely to satisfy a rubric.
Oh, yeah, like a high school English essay.
Right. Or, maybe a corporate performance review.
Oh, the worst.
It really is. You sit down, you look at the requirements, and you build it like a piece of flat-pack furniture.
Slotting in an introduction here.
Exactly. You
Right, or
manufacture a
that.
complication, you build the rising action, you drop in a climax, and you just bolt on a neat little resolution.
And then you step back and look at it.
Yeah. And technically, structurally, it's flawless. Every single box is ticked.
But when you actually read it out loud, it feels entirely lifeless.
Completely dead on the page.
It has all the structural integrity of like a manual for a microwave oven and roughly the exact same amount of soul.
Which is incredibly frustrating. You followed the rules. You gave the system exactly what the system demanded.
But the magic just isn't there.
Right. The actual human connection that makes reading and writing worthwhile is completely absent. So, welcome to the deep dive.
We're so glad you're here with us.
Today, we are tearing apart the standardized testing machine. We're looking at those rigid paint-by-numbers formulas that have, frankly, hijacked the way we teach literacy.
It's a massive issue.
It really is. We are looking at a stack of fascinating research today, centering on a breakthrough framework. It's called the Reading for Emotion model.
Also known as RfE. And the mission for our conversation today really is to explore how this model shatters decades of traditional teaching methods.
Decades of it.
Yeah. For a very long time, educational systems have relied heavily on strict linguistic formulas.
Just checking boxes.
Exactly. They use these formulas to give their grading rubrics a veneer of scientific credibility, like it's absolute objectivity.
But the research we are unpacking today reveals something completely different. By clinging to these formulas, the system is actively refusing to engage intellectually with a much deeper biological reality.
A profound reality, honestly.
And that reality is that human emotions are the actual architects of our cognition.
Which sounds a bit wild at first.
It does. We tend to think of emotions as these messy, abstract things, right? Just stuff that happens in the background.
But the neuroscience shows they literally organize how we think.
Wow. Literally organize it.
Yes. They direct our attention, they filter what we understand, and they forge our memories.
So if you strip the emotion out of learning, just to satisfy a grading rubric,
You are literally starving the brain of the fuel it needs to process information.
that is, that is huge. We are looking at a massive fundamental tension here.
We really are.
Yeah.
On one side, we have traditional formulaic literacy assessments.
Right.
The source material specifically examines Australia's standardized testing system, known as NAPLAN, and the linguistic framework it relies on.
Systemic functional linguistics, right?
Exactly. And on the other side of this tension, we have the cutting-edge neuroscience of how the human brain actually learns and adapts to the world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by dissecting the enemy here.
The trap, so to speak.
Yeah, before we can appreciate the breakthrough, we need to understand the trap. The sources heavily critique this reliance on systemic functional linguistics.
Which we'll just call SFL for the sake of our sanity.
Please, yes.
There.
So, what actually is SFL, and how did it mutate into this rigid trap for students and teachers?
Well, systemic functional linguistics originally started as a very nuanced way of looking at language. It was developed by a linguist named Michael Halliday.
Okay.
And the core idea was that language is a network of choices, and the choices we make depend on our social context.
Which sounds great in theory.
It does. But when that theory gets funneled into a massive standardized testing environment like NAPLAN,
It loses all its nuance.
completely, it devolves into a rigid taxonomy. It becomes a literal checklist of structural features.
Because, if you have to grade hundreds of thousands of student essays across an entire country, you can't have graders subjectively evaluating the social context of every piece.
Right. You need a machine-like metric.
Precisely the problem.
And the researchers critiquing this, Caldwell and White, they point out that NAPLAN relies on an incredibly restrictive definition of what a storytelling genre even is.
Like, how restrictive are we talking?
To pass the test, a student must adhere to a strict complication resolution framework.
Ah, the classic structure.
Yeah. You must introduce a setting, you must introduce a problem, and you must neatly resolve that problem.
So what happens if they don't?
If a student writes a brilliant, evocative piece of prose that doesn't neatly resolve a specific complication, the SFL rubric demands that the grader heavily penalize the student for poor text structure.
Now, wait, I want to push back on this for a second. Let's play devil's advocate for the educational boards.
Sure, go for it.
If I am running a national curriculum,
Yeah.
I need standardization, right? If we just tell kids, write whatever you feel, and tell graders, just grade based on the vibes.
The whole system collapses.
Exactly. It collapses into anarchy. Isn't this complication resolution checklist just a necessary evil of public education?
I see what you're saying.
I mean, we need an objective measure to ensure a child knows how to construct a narrative.
Well, the counter-argument to that is, what are we actually measuring?
Okay.
Are we measuring a child's ability to communicate human experience, or are we just measuring their compliance with the manufacturing process?
Oh, wow. Compliance with the manufacturing process.
Yeah. The source manuscript argues that this SFL approach forces educators to adapt their actual pedagogy, the way they teach in the classroom, to fit pre-existing rigid frameworks.
So teachers stop teaching students how to communicate effectively.
And start teaching them how to pass the rubric.
It sounds like we're judging the quality of a meal purely by inspecting the kitchen.
That is a perfect analogy.
Like the inspector comes in, ignores the food entirely, but checks the clipboard.
Yeah.
Did the chef use exactly 3 pots, a whisk, and a spatula? Yes. Then this is a 5-star meal.
Right, without even tasting it.
Ticking the structural boxes doesn't make it a good story. It just makes it an easily quantifiable data point.
Exactly. And even the researchers who recognize this problem often find themselves trapped by the very linguistic systems they are trying to fix.
How so?
Well, Caldwell and White looked at the NAPLAN system. They realized that forcing every single text into a complication resolution box was unfair and decided to offer a solution.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But their solution was just to invent a different box.
Wait, what was their new box?
They introduced the concept of the remarkable event.
The remarkable event.
Yeah, they argued that not all writing needs a neat resolution to be valid. Some texts, they suggested, are just anecdotes.
Anecdotes, okay.
Right. In an anecdote, a character simply reacts to a remarkable event, and there doesn't need to be a traditional resolution.
I see where this is going.
So their logic was, if a story doesn't fit the narrative rubric, the grader should check if it fits the anecdote rubric.
That is the most bureaucratic solution imaginable.
It really is.
Like, our rigid checklist is destroying art, so we have issued a secondary, slightly different rigid checklist to compensate.
It completely sidesteps the actual issue.
By obsessing over whether a student's text is formally classified as a narrative or an anecdote, the entire educational apparatus is refusing to engage with why the child wrote the words in the first place.
They are analyzing the text as if it were an archaeological artifact, completely devoid of human intent.
Just staring at the structure.
Right. The SFL framework provides this comforting illusion of scientific objectivity.
It lets the grader off the hook.
Exactly. It allows a grader to say, well, I am not judging your art. I am simply observing that you failed to include a rising action.
But to understand why this illusion of objectivity is actually deeply harmful to a developing mind, we have to pull back the curtain on how the human brain processes information.
Which brings us to some genuinely groundbreaking neuroscience detailed in our sources.
Specifically, the work of Ian McGilchrist.
Yes, from his monumental 2021 synthesis, The Matter with Things.
He analyzed thousands of neurological studies regarding the brain's hemispheres, and he completely dismantles a pop psychology myth that I think almost everyone listening to this has internalized at some point.
The old myth that the left side of your brain is the cold, calculating mathematical accountant.
Right, and the right side of your brain is the free-spirited watercolor painting artist.
McGilchrist proves that this geographical division of tasks is entirely wrong.
So the accountant and the artist don't live in separate rooms.
No, both hemispheres are involved in almost everything we do.
Okay, so what's the actual difference?
The critical difference is not what they do, but how they do it. They process the exact same world using entirely different modes of attention.
Let's ground this in reality for the listener.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at a complex problem, say, I'm trying to navigate a new city, how does my left hemisphere approach that versus my right hemisphere?
Okay, good example. Your left hemisphere's primary biological imperative is to simplify the world so that you can manipulate it.
Break it down.
Right. It wants to grasp things, literally and metaphorically. To do that, it has to break the world down into explicit, static, decontextualized parts.
So if I'm navigating a city,
The left hemisphere only cares about the rigid grid of the map. It focuses on the street names, the traffic lights, the explicit rules.
it's the ultimate reductionist. It strips away all the noise to give you a usable tool.
Yes. But here is the terrifying flaw of the left hemisphere. It prioritizes consistency over accuracy.
Wait, consistency over accuracy.
Yes, it is highly self-referential. It builds a model of how the world should work based on its simplified rules, and it desperately wants the world to obey that model.
So the left hemisphere would rather be completely wrong about reality as long as it is consistently following its own internal logic.
That is exactly what the clinical data shows.
That's wild.
If the left hemisphere encounters an anomaly, like a piece of information that contradicts its rigid model, it panics. It hates uncertainty.
So what does it do?
It will often literally confabulate.
Like, just make things up.
Exactly. It'll invent a fabricated story to explain away the anomaly, or it will just outright deny that the conflicting information exists at all.
It will bend reality to protect its checklist.
That's a perfect way to put it.
That is mind-bending. Okay, so if the left hemisphere is this rigid, denial-prone bureaucrat, what mode of attention is the right hemisphere using?
The right hemisphere provides the holistic view. It sees the gestalt, the overarching whole.
It doesn't break things down into isolated parts.
No, it integrates interconnected processes and thrives on contextual richness.
Okay.
While the left hemisphere recoils from uncertainty, the right hemisphere is built for it. It maintains a broad, vigilant, open attention.
So it's fine with things being messy.
It excels at processing novel information and is completely comfortable tolerating ambiguity.
Wow. If I map this back to the educational crisis we were just talking about,
Huh.
traditional teachers relying on rigid SFL linguistic formulas, demanding that every story have a neat complication and resolution.
Yes.
That is a pure, unadulterated left hemisphere approach to education.
Exactly.
They're demanding that complex, emotionally messy, human stories be stripped of their context and forced into static, predictable boxes.
They are essentially turning off the right hemisphere of the student. The SFL approach reduces the indivisible emotional whole of a story into simplistic, mechanistic parts.
That's so damaging.
And the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran provides a brilliant term for why this is so dangerous. He describes the right hemisphere as the brain's devil's advocate, or its anomaly detector.
The anomaly detector, I love that. Like a built-in alarm system for when our mental models stop matching reality.
Right. When the left brain's rigid rules fail to make sense of a complex situation, it just tries to force the pieces together. It preserves the status quo at all costs.
But when the anomaly becomes too glaring to ignore,
Then the right hemisphere, the devil's advocate, intervenes. It forces a paradigm shift.
it tells the brain, the old rules are broken.
Yeah.
We need to construct an entirely new schema to understand this. And that paradigm shift, that moment of realization where your entire worldview expands to accommodate new information, that is what true transformative learning actually is.
Yes.
It's not memorizing a map. It's learning how to navigate when the map catches fire.
Which brings us to the ultimate pedagogical failure here. If we want students to experience those paradigm shifts, we cannot keep feeding them left brain formulas.
We're starving the anomaly detector.
We are, but to activate that holistic right hemisphere, we have to engage the system that actually tells the brain what is worth paying attention to in the first place.
And this is the core breakthrough of the entire manuscript. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does.
What is the mechanism that tells the right hemisphere, hey, wake up, this new information is important?
It's the exact thing that traditional academia has spent a century dismissing as fluffy, irrelevant, and unscientific.
Emotions. To engage the learning centers of the brain, we have to engage human emotion.
Yes. The research from Jack Panksepp in 1998 and later synthesized by Gottlieb and colleagues in 2022 makes a biologically profound claim.
Let's hear it.
Emotions are not just decorative feelings, they aren't a byproduct of thinking. Emotions are subjective sensations that are intrinsically tied to motivational significance.
Meaning what exactly?
The claim in the literature is absolute. No cognitive system operates independently of emotional processing.
Okay, let's unpack the biology of that.
Yeah.
Why is emotion the gatekeeper of cognition? If I'm trying to learn algebra or how to write a persuasive essay, why does my brain require an emotional baseline to process that data?
It all comes down to cellular energy. The researcher Mary Helena Mordino-Yang explains this beautifully.
Okay.
The human brain is an incredibly energy-hungry organ. It makes up about 2% of our body weight, but it consumes 20% of our daily caloric intake.
That's a massive power draw.
Exactly. Building new neural pathways, which is what learning physically is, costs a massive amount of biological energy.
So the brain is an extreme conservationist. it isn't going to burn precious calories rewiring itself for information that doesn't matter.
Right. Expending neural resources on information devoid of personal relevance is biologically inefficient. The brain needs a signal to justify the energy expenditure.
And emotion is that signal.
Emotion is that signal. Emotions evolved to tell the organism what is necessary for survival, what is necessary for social standing, and what is necessary for growth.
Which makes sense because human brain development is inherently social and emotional.
Yes. Therefore, deep abstract reasoning and memory recall are completely dependent on experiencing an emotional stake in the information.
Which perfectly explains why a student sitting in a classroom being forced to write a complication resolution story about a topic they have zero connection to retains absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
The teacher thinks the student's just being lazy, but the student's brain is literally acting as a biological firewall.
It's saying this information has no motivational significance. Do not waste calories committing this rubric to long-term memory.
Traditional literacy education misses this entirely because it treats emotion as a low-level, primitive function.
They view cognition logic, reason, structure as the high-level executive, and emotion as an unruly subordinate.
Maybe they allow emotion in the classroom as a descriptive tool, like teaching a kid to write the boy felt sad instead of the boy frowned.
Right, surface level
Right.
stuff. But they refuse to engage with emotion as the actual organizer of the student's intellect.
By refusing to engage with emotion as the organizer of cognition, formula-reliant teachers are basically fighting against the brain's biological nature.
They really are.
To really drive home how emotion drives exploration and learning, the sources bring up a fascinating historical case study.
Oh, the Colette example.
Yeah, it's an analysis by the researcher Friedman, looking at the writings of the legendary French journalist and novelist Colette when she first moved to Paris.
Between 1911 and 1914.
Right. It is a perfect illustration of right hemisphere learning.
You have a young woman arriving in Belle Epoque, Paris, a massive, sprawling, chaotic metropolis.
If you approach this from a left hemisphere perspective, you would assume she was terrified, disempowered, and reliant on a strict, rigid map to survive.
She should have been paralyzed by the sensory overload.
But she wasn't. Friedman's analysis of her early Parisian writings shows that she didn't try to reduce the city to a left-brain checklist.
She didn't buy a guidebook and memorize street grids.
No, she utilized her emotional and cultural knowledge. She explored the neighborhoods, observed the customs of the people, and constantly compared these new, novel experiences to what she already knew.
Using her emotional resonance as the measuring stick.
Exactly. She was engaging what Panksepp calls the emotional seeking circuitry of the brain.
The seeking system.
Yeah, this is the mammalian drive to explore, to investigate, to make sense of the unknown. It's the biological thrill of curiosity.
And when the seeking system is activated, the brain is flooded with dopamine.
Which doesn't just make us feel good, it chemically locks in learning and memory.
Colette was exploring the resources of her own cultural and emotional knowledge. That exploration, driven entirely by her emotional engagement with the environment, allowed her to generate new possibilities.
She didn't just survive Paris. She adapted to it and eventually dominated its literary scene.
She reorganized her internal schema of the world through emotional exploration, not through rote memorization of a city grid.
Okay, the biological reality is undeniable. Learning requires emotional engagement. The right hemisphere needs emotional relevance to authorize the caloric burn of building new mental models.
Yes.
But here's the practical friction. How on earth do we actually teach this?
That's the million-dollar question.
If I am a teacher, I can't just tell my students, feel more deeply, and then write an A on their paper. We need a methodology that bridges the gap between biological reality and classroom application.
And that is exactly where the reading for emotion model, the RfE model, steps into the spotlight.
The RfE model, introduced by Lian in 2017.
Right. And it executes a brilliant pivot. Instead of looking at emotions descriptively, like asking a student to identify if a protagonist is happy or angry, the RfE model uses emotions analytically.
Analytically?
Yes, it uses them to uncover the foundational structural architecture of a text.
I really want to highlight how radical this shift is. We are moving from treating emotion as a decorative coat of paint on a story to recognizing emotion as the actual load-bearing walls of the narrative structure.
That's a great metaphor. The RfE model identifies 6 structural elements that well-crafted texts universally share, regardless of their specific genre.
Okay, walk me through them.
The 6 stages are focus, disturbance, dialogue development, resolution, and moral.
Now wait, I am looking at that list And my left hemisphere is screaming that this is just another checklist.
I know, it sounds like one.
How is focus, disturbance, resolution any different from the SFL trap of introduction, complication, revolution? Aren't we just swapping out one set of rigid linguistic handcuffs for another?
It is the most important distinction we can make today. I really want to emphasize this. The difference lies entirely in what these markers represent.
Okay.
In the SFL model, a complication is a literal mechanical plot event. A meteor strikes, a bank is robbed, a dog goes missing. It is a rigid demand for an external action.
Right.
In the RfE model, these 6 steps are not a checklist of plot mechanics. They are markers for internal shifts in emotion.
So if the old method was a rigid architectural blueprint, the RfE model is more like a heat map of the reader's emotional journey.
A heat map is perfect. It tracks where the emotional temperature spikes, where it cools down, and where it stabilizes.
Let's trace that heat map for you listening at home. The first stage is the focus.
Right. Its purpose isn't just to describe the physical setting of the room. Its purpose is to establish the baseline emotional tone for the reader. It sets the ambient temperature.
Then comes the disturbance, which, to be clear, isn't necessarily a car crash.
No, it's any shift in the narrative mood. It's a thermal spike. It could be a transition from calm to anxious, or from boredom to sudden curiosity.
It's the moment the anomaly detector wakes up.
Exactly. Then the dialogue stage provides a specific perspective or reflection on that emotional shift.
And the development.
The development details the cascading events that follow, tracking the emotional escalation or de-escalation.
Leading to the resolution.
Right, which clarifies the final emotional outcome. Not necessarily solving the literal problem, but resolving the emotional tension.
And finally, the moral.
Which is the core emotional takeaway. It is the fundamental truth about the human experience that the author wants to imprint on the reader's brain.
What I love about this is that the sources note authors apply these stages with incredible elasticity.
It's definitely not a rigid formula.
Sometimes elements are entirely implied based on the context. There's a fantastic example in the manuscript about reading a simple recipe for chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, that's a great test case. Because SFL would classify a recipe as an instructional text, devoid of narrative structure.
But RfE recognizes it as an emotional journey.
Right, think about it. What is the moral of a recipe?
It doesn't have a paragraph at the end saying, and the moral of the story is that cookies bring families together.
No. But the implied emotional moral is the satisfaction of achieving the dish pictured in the cookbook.
The disturbance is your current state of hunger.
The development is the act of mixing the ingredients.
And the resolution is pulling the tray out of the oven. If you follow the steps, you resolve the emotional tension of hunger with the joy of a perfect cookie.
Which proves that the RfE model is not about prescriptive correctness. A teacher using RfE doesn't punish a student for failing to explicitly write a dialogue stage.
The goal is to cultivate reflective thinking. It gives students a vocabulary to represent the emotional shifts they are naturally feeling as they read.
And it empowers them to consciously engineer those thermal spikes when they write.
It's giving the student the tools to facilitate a dynamic, intentional conversation between their right hemisphere and the blank page.
Absolutely.
But, theoretical models are only as good as their real-world application. To prove how superior this model is to the old linguistic formulas, the source material suggests applying both methods to an actual piece of student writing from the NetPlan testing.
And this case study is infuriating and illuminating in equal measure. The text is a short story written by a student simply titled Lovely Purple Boots.
Let me set the emotional stage for this story for you. The protagonist inherits a pair of cherished purple boots from her grandmother. It's a gift she absolutely adores.
But suddenly the grandmother unexpectedly passes away.
Yeah. And after her death, these boots take on magical properties. They begin to glow, they float, and they physically guide the protagonist away from her home, whisking her into a metaphysical space described as the land of the dead.
While she is traversing the surreal landscape, she experiences a profound internal realization.
The story concludes with her stating, "It all makes sense now. I want my grandma back."
It is a stunning, evocative piece of writing for a student. Now, let's look at how the standardized system evaluated it.
Oh, this makes me so mad.
The NetPlan examiners, armed with their left-brain SFL rubrics, deemed the story structurally flawed. They penalized the student, giving it a 3 out of 4 for text structure.
Why? What possible justification did they have for docking points on a story that clearly communicates such a heavy theme?
Because it failed the checklist. According to the SFL rubric, A narrative must have a neatly wrapped conclusion.
Okay.
The examiners argued that waking up in the land of the dead did not resolve the initial complication of the grandmother dying.
Are you kidding?
In fact, they argued it introduced a brand new complication right at the end of the text, which violates the structural rules of the genre.
They penalized a child for writing a complex, surrealist metaphor about the all-encompassing nature of grief simply because the metaphor didn't fit neatly into their little box. It is academic malpractice.
It actually gets worse when the researchers try to intervene.
How could it get worse?
Well, Caldwell and White, the academics critiquing the NAPLAN grading, stepped in to defend the student. But remember, they are still operating within the SFL paradigm.
Right, they just want to use a different checklist.
Exactly. So they argue that the examiners graded it wrong because Lovely Purple Boots isn't a narrative. They argue it should be classified and graded as an anecdote.
Because an anecdote is just a reaction to a remarkable event. So they are trying to loophole the system.
Yes. Caldwell and White argue that being transported to the land of the dead is the remarkable event. And to justify this structural classification, they analyze the ending.
What's their analysis?
They conclude that the protagonist's final realization, it all makes sense now, I want my grandma back, is an expression of emotional relief.
Relief.
They literally publish the argument that the protagonist is relieved to discover that she is dead because it resolves the complication of her grief by allowing her to reunite with her grandmother.
I'm sorry, relief that she's dead. That completely misses the point of the story.
It ignores the entire take-home message.
Any human being reading that story with their right hemisphere engaged knows it is a story about the agonizing, unresolvable longing of grief. It is not a cheerful sigh of relief about dying to go hang out with grandma.
It raises a vital question, though. How does a highly educated professional researcher arrive at an interpretation that is so divorced from the obvious human reality of the text?
Because they are analyzing it as a mathematical equation.
Exactly.
They are looking at the text purely as a linguistic artifact. They are so obsessively focused on identifying the structure of the remarkable event that they completely miss the heartbeat of the human being who wrote the words.
That is the left hemisphere trap in action. It prioritizes consistency with the anecdote theory over the accurate reality of the emotional communication.
Man.
So let's apply the RfE breakthrough to Lovely Purple Boots. Let's map the heat map and see what is actually happening.
Let's do it. Where are the thermal spikes?
When we track the emotional shifts, the true brilliance of the student's architecture is unveiled. The focus stage establishes the baseline, her deep affection for the boots, and her connection to her grandmother.
Right.
The disturbance is the massive thermal spike of the grandmother's unexpected death. It shatters the baseline.
And the development is her journey into the metaphysical space. The SFL graders saw the floating boots in the land of the dead as a clumsy plot complication.
But through the RfE lens, it's a profound metaphor. The magical boots guiding her aren't a new external problem. They are the internal vehicle for her emotional processing.
Exactly. The surreal landscape is a representation of her internal terrain of grief, which brings us to the true resolution.
Right. The resolution of the story was never about solving a literal plot problem. It's an emotional resolve.
It's not a literal death, it's an emotional journey.
She confronts the overwhelming landscape of her loss and achieves a moment of absolute emotional clarity about what she truly desires.
I want my grandma back. It's devastating. And the implied moral of the story crystallizes beautifully.
What's the moral?
The author is communicating a universal truth, that cherished physical possessions of our loved ones don't just remind us of them, they forge a deeper, lasting, almost magical connection to them after they are gone.
The RfE model reveals an elegant, tree-like structure in the student's writing. The opening focus on the boots and the final emotional resolution regarding the grandmother act as perfect narrative bookends.
They perfectly map the protagonist's journey from loss and confusion to hope and clarity.
It's an impeccable structure.
And that entire layer of nuance, all that beauty, was completely invisible to the SFL genre approach.
Completely.
But it's not just that the SFL model fails to see the beauty in good stories. The host. The sources point out that it also completely fails to explain why bad stories don't work.
This is a crucial point for pedagogy because structure needs purpose. The manuscript provides two other examples of student writing from the sources to demonstrate this.
What are they?
A story called Zip and a story called Wooden Box. Let's look at Zip first.
Zip is a story about a kid who spends 2 days hanging out with an extraterrestrial alien named Zordian.
Right, and it's basically just a chronological recounting of the wacky things they did together.
So how does SFL grade this?
Well, SFL proponents like Caldwell and White look at Zip and argue that it is a perfectly acceptable example of the recount genre.
Because it's a chronological telling of events.
Yes, so it ticks the recount boxes. It doesn't need a complication or a resolution, so structurally, it passes.
But the text notes that anyone actually reading the story feels that it falls completely flat at the end.
Right, it loses all its effective impact.
It just abruptly stops. And why does it feel flat? Because the ending fails to link back to the condition that prompted the story in the first place.
Exactly. The writer just listed events. But if they had understood the emotional architecture, if they had added just one sentence at the end, something like, spending time with an alien is surprising and fun.
Right. It would have resolved the emotional tension. A genre checklist can't tell a student why their ending felt flat, but an emotional analysis can.
It's the exact same problem with the wooden box text.
Oh, tell us about Wooden Box.
The student writes this highly suspenseful, anxiety-inducing story about being trapped in a dark wooden box. The tension is incredibly high.
It's gripping.
It is, and then it just ends with the oldest cliche in the book, and then I woke up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Caldwell and White look at the rubric and say, well, it's an anecdote reacting to a remarkable event, so grade it as a pass.
But objectively, as a piece of human communication, it is terrible writing. It takes all that built-up suspense and just punctures it, dissipating the energy without giving the reader any emotional payoff.
And this highlights a fascinating concept introduced by researchers Voloshinov and White back in 2000.
What's the concept?
They propose that all texts, regardless of their format, whether it's a poem, an essay, or a story about an alien, are contextually anchored responses to a problem. A text originates from an issue and moves toward a resolution. Teaching students this complication resolution framework isn't about boxing them into a genre.
Right.
It's about helping them understand the communicative impact they are trying to deliver to another human being.
Now, I can hear the skeptics shouting at their speakers right now. If the RfE model relies on subjective emotions and tracing invisible heat maps, how do we know our interpretation is valid?
Who is objectively right?
Yeah, you think the boots are about grief? I think they are about relief. Who's to say?
That is the left hemisphere panicking. The left hemisphere screams, if there isn't a strict quantifiable rule, it's chaos.
But the source material doesn't leave us in the realm of subjective vibes. They introduce a hard science neurological theory to back it up.
Yes. They bring in Ramachandran and Herstein's 1999 neurological theory of aesthetic experience.
Neuroscience of aesthetics. So what does this all mean? Unpack this for us.
Ramachandran and Herstein start with the premise that art is communication, and this theory outlines 8 laws of how the brain generates contrast and meaning.
8 laws. Okay.
Yeah. Isolation, peak shift, grouping, contrast, symmetry, perceptual problem solving, generic viewpoint, and metaphor. These laws dictate what the brain naturally finds beautiful or engaging.
Okay, let's put this theory to the test.
Yeah.
I want to apply these hard neurological laws to the lovely purple boots story to test the RfE analysis. Let's see if our emotional heat map holds up.
Okay, let's start with isolation and generic viewpoint.
How does the student use isolation?
The narrative brilliantly isolates the protagonist's internal grief. It strips away all other potential narrative distractions. We don't hear about what her parents are doing or the logistics of the funeral.
It artificially restricts the data to focus the brain entirely on her internal emotional landscape.
Exactly. And through a generic viewpoint, meaning the narrative doesn't jump around through confusing angles, the theme of the boots remains a consistent focal point for the brain.
That makes perfect sense. What about contrast and metaphor?
Contrast is fundamental to how our brains work. In literature, the brain seeks thematic contrast. And metaphor is the brain's ability to connect 2 distinct neural maps, finding hidden similarities.
Which is exactly where lovely purple boots shines. The boots aren't just literal footwear.
Right.
They represent a massive thematic contrast between physical, material inheritance and invisible emotional legacy. They are a metaphor for her unfulfilled longing for comfort.
The brain is highly rewarded with dopamine when it successfully connects those 2 maps, which leads into perceptual problem solving.
Explain this one. Why does the brain want a problem?
Because the brain actively dislikes having the answer handed to it. The brain loves a struggle. When the narrative system has to struggle slightly to find the solution, the aha moment triggers a much larger release of neurochemicals.
And the text guides the reader perfectly. From empathy to surprise with the magical land to a profound emotional resolve. You have to solve the emotional puzzle to reach that ending.
Exactly. And the student aided that process using the law of perceptual grouping. Evolutionary biology wired us to group patterns together.
So how did the student use that?
The magical powers of the boots, they glow, they float, they guide her. These are perceptual groupings that the author used to articulate the invisible emotional weight of grief.
By making the boots float, she took the invisible feeling of loss and turned it into a pattern the reader can mentally see.
Contrary to the NEPLAN examiners calling it structurally flawed, the aesthetic analysis proves the story is impeccably crafted.
The brain's right hemisphere recognizes the beauty and symmetry of the emotional journey, even when the left hemisphere's checklist rejects it.
It completely validates the student's intuition, but the manuscript offers one final, incredibly practical classroom tool for teachers, a way to test the consistency of a student's interpretation.
The summary test. How does this work?
It's creating a text summary based on the pivotal emotional and aesthetic themes identified by the RfE heat map.
Let's demonstrate the difference. If you summarize the lovely purple boots text just on plot, it's about a girl who gets boots and goes to the land of the dead.
It sounds absurd.
Yeah, it completely strips the dignity from the art.
But utilizing the RfE model, the summary transforms. The student starts by highlighting the moral, the themes of loss, longing, and the power of possessions.
And tracks the disturbance and resolution.
Right. The disturbance of confronting feelings and the resolution of achieving a deeper understanding of her loss.
This forces the student to depart from just regurgitating facts. You are actively synthesizing the author's intent. It proves that learning is transformative, not just transactional.
And this ties perfectly back to the grand theme of the deep dive today. This pedagogical strategy fosters a dynamic conversation between the right and left hemispheres.
It teaches students to tolerate ambiguity.
Yes. To explore multiple possibilities without needing an immediate resolution, and fundamentally reorganizes their established schemas.
It improves abstract reasoning and social competencies simultaneously. Because to understand a text emotionally, you have to practice empathy.
It is a massive paradigm shift.
To summarize this massive shift for you today, we're talking about moving away from the safety of left-brain linguistic formulas and bravely stepping into the right-brain reality where emotions are the true architects of our learning, memory, and attention.
It requires courage from educators to let go of that illusion of objectivity.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something building on the sources.
We live in an era where AI can instantly generate texts that perfectly follow linguistic rules, genre checklists, and SFL frameworks.
Flawlessly, in milliseconds. But if our brains are biologically wired to only engage deeply with information that holds human, emotional, and motivational significance,
What happens to our cognition as we are flooded with perfectly structured yet emotionally hollow artificial text?
will our right hemispheres recognize the anomaly and reject it? Or will we stop reading for emotion altogether?
It may be the ultimate test of our literacy.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to look at the next story you read or write, not as a structure of words, but as a map of human emotion. Let the magic back in. We'll see you next time.